The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly by the large window in her private sitting room. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The steam had stopped rising hours ago, much like the hope that had been slowly fading from her heart over the past few weeks. Prince William had left for his official duties early that morning, just as he had every day for the past month. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of unspoken words and the heaviness of a conversation that neither of them seemed ready to have. Their marriage, once the fairy tale that captured the world's attention, was quietly unraveling behind the closed doors of their royal residence. Catherine had noticed the change in William months earlier. It started with small things, missed dinners, longer working hours, and conversations that seemed to happen around important topics rather than about them. The man who once couldn't wait to share every detail of his day with her now spoke in careful, measured sentences that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. She remembered their early days together at St. Andrew's University when they were just Kate Middleton and Prince William, two young people figuring out life and love. Back then, William would talk for hours about everything and nothing. He shared his fears about his royal responsibilities, his memories of his mother, Princess Diana, and his dreams for a future that somehow always included her in every scenario. Now, as she watched the gardeners tending to the rose garden below, Catherine wondered when exactly those conversations had stopped. When had they become two people living parallel lives under the same roof? The realization hit her like a cold wave. They had been saying goodbye to each other slowly, silently, for months without either of them acknowledging it. The children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, had become their safe topic of conversation. They could discuss school events, play dates, and bedtime stories without venturing into the dangerous territory of their own relationship. But even those conversations had become shorter and more practical. William would ask about homework schedules and doctor appointments, but he no longer lingered to hear the funny things the children had said or the small milestones they had reached. Catherine set down her cold tea and walked to her desk, where a stack of official correspondence waited for her attention. Among the letters was one that had arrived the previous day, an invitation to a charity gala that she and William traditionally attended together. She stared at the elegant script, knowing that this year, like so many recent events, they would arrive separately, stand together for photographs, and return home in silence. The weight of maintaining their public image while their private world crumbled had become exhausting. Every public appearance required them to perform the role of the perfect royal couple, smiling and engaging with each other in ways that felt increasingly foreign in their daily lives. Catherine had become skilled at placing her hand on William's arm at just the right moment for photographers, while internally feeling the distance between them grow wider. She thought about the last time they had laughed together, really laughed, not the polite chuckles they exchanged during public events. It had been months ago, during a family movie night with the children. Louis had made a silly face during a particularly serious scene, and both parents had burst into genuine laughter. For just a moment, Catherine had seen a glimpse of the old William, the one who used to make her laugh until her sides hurt. That memory felt like it belonged to different people now. The William she had fallen in love with seemed to be disappearing, bit by bit, replaced by someone who carried the weight of the crown so heavily that there was little room left for anything else, including their marriage. Catherine understood the pressures he faced, the constant scrutiny, the expectations, the knowledge that every decision he made would be analyzed and criticized. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. The sound of a car pulling into the courtyard below caught her attention. William was returning earlier than usual, but Catherine felt no excitement at the prospect of seeing him. Instead, she felt the familiar knot in her stomach that had become her constant companion. She wondered what version of her husband would walk through the door, the distant stranger he had become, or perhaps, if she was lucky, a glimpse of the man she had married. As she heard his footsteps on the stairs, Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had made a decision that morning, one that had been building inside her for weeks. Tonight, she would finally break the silence that had settled between them like a thick fog. She would ask the questions that terrified her and speak the words that had been trapped in her throat for so long. The footsteps paused outside her door, and Catherine held her breath. For a moment she hoped he would knock, that he would choose to enter her space and bridge the gap between them. But after a few seconds, the footsteps continued down the hall toward his own study. Catherine opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the window glass. The woman staring back at her looked tired and sad, nothing like the glowing bride, who had walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey years earlier. She knew that tonight would change everything between them, one way or another. The silent goodbye they had been living through would finally find its voice, and they would have to face the truth that both of them had been avoiding. Their fairy tale was ending, not with dramatic arguments or public scandals, but with the quiet erosion of two hearts that had simply grown too far apart to find their way back to each other. The evening dinner was a quiet affair, as most had become in recent months. Prince William sat at one end of the polished dining table, while Catherine occupied her usual seat at the other end. The distance between them felt much greater than the few feet of mahogany that separated their place settings. The children had eaten earlier in the nursery, leaving their parents alone with only the soft clinking of silverware against china to break the silence. Catherine watched her husband as he methodically cut his food and ate without really tasting anything. His mind was clearly elsewhere, probably reviewing the day's meetings or preparing for tomorrow's obligations. She had once found his dedication to duty admirable, even attractive. Now it felt like a wall that kept growing higher between them, brick by brick, meeting by meeting, until she could barely see the man she had fallen in love with. "The children asked if you could read to them tonight," Catherine said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched on for too long. "Charlotte specifically requested that story about the dragon you used to do the voices for." William looked up from his plate, and for a brief moment, Catherine saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps regret or longing, or maybe just exhaustion. "I have some papers to review tonight," he replied, his voice neutral and diplomatic, the same tone he used with government officials and foreign dignitaries. "Perhaps tomorrow evening." Catherine nodded, though they both knew tomorrow would bring its own set of excuses. She had stopped counting how many tomorrows had passed since William had last spent an evening with their children that wasn't scheduled by his private secretary. Even their family time had become another item, on his official calendar, squeezed between state business and royal obligations. "Do you remember," Catherine began carefully, "when George was little, and you used to say that being a father was the one job that mattered more than being a prince?" She watched William's face, hoping to see some recognition, some spark of the passionate young father he had once been. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Things were different then," he said, returning his attention to his dinner. "The responsibilities were different." But Catherine knew it wasn't just the responsibilities that had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in William after his grandfather Prince Philip's death, and then again after Queen Elizabeth's passing. The weight of the crown, still years away from actually resting on his head, had already begun to transform him into someone she barely recognized. The carefree prince who had swept her off her feet at university had been replaced by a man who carried the entire monarchy on his shoulders. She understood the pressure he felt. Truly she did. But what hurt most was how he had shut her out completely, as if sharing that burden with his wife would somehow make him appear weak. Catherine had been prepared to support him through anything when she said her wedding vows. But she couldn't support someone who wouldn't let her in. After dinner, They retreated to their separate spaces, as had become their routine. William disappeared into his study with his leather briefcase, while Catherine made her way to the children's rooms for their bedtime routine. As she tucked Louis into his small bed, her youngest son looked up at her with curious eyes. "Mama, why doesn't Papa tell us stories anymore?" Louis asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. Catherine's heart clenched as she smoothed his hair. "Papa is very busy with important work, sweetheart," she said, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. "But George's friend's Papa works too, and he still plays football with them on weekends," Louis continued, unknowingly twisting the knife deeper into Catherine's already wounded heart. She kissed her son's forehead and whispered, "Sleep tight, my love," before quietly leaving his room. In the hallway, she paused and listened to the muffled sound of William's voice coming from his study. He was on another phone call, probably with officials in Australia or Canada, managing royal business across time zones that never seemed to sleep. Catherine realized that she had become a single parent in all but name. She was the one who attended school plays, handled scraped knees, and listened to their children's hopes and fears. William had become a distant figure in their lives, present in body during scheduled family photo opportunities, but absent in all the ways that truly mattered. Walking to her own sitting room, Catherine found herself looking at the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece. There were pictures from their wedding day, images from family holidays, and candid shots from happier times. In every photo, she could see the love and connection that had once existed between them. The couple in those pictures looked at each other with genuine affection and joy, as if they shared secrets that no one else in the world could understand. Now they were like polite strangers sharing a house, careful not to intrude on each other's space or interrupt each other's routines. They discussed schedules and logistics, but never dreams or fears. They slept in the same bed, but might as well have been on different continents for all the intimacy that remained between them. Catherine picked up a photo from their honeymoon in the Seychelles. In the picture, William was looking at her instead of the camera, his eyes full of adoration and promise. She remembered that moment clearly. He had been telling her about all the places he wanted to take her, all the adventures they would share together. He had spoken about growing old together, about watching their children become adults, about facing whatever challenges came their way as a team. She wondered what that younger version of William would think of the man he had become. Would he recognize himself in the cold, distant stranger who now occupied his place? Or would he be as heartbroken as Catherine felt, watching their beautiful beginning transform into this painful ending? The sound of William's study door opening echoed through the quiet house, followed by his familiar footsteps on the stairs. Catherine glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, another day lost to duty and obligation. She listened as he moved quietly through their bedroom, probably assuming she was already asleep, as she had been pretending to be for weeks now. Tomorrow, Catherine decided, would be different. Tomorrow she would stop pretending that their silence was normal or that time would somehow heal what was breaking between them. Tomorrow she would find the courage to speak the words that needed to be said, even if they were the words that would finally, officially, bring their fairy tale to its end. But tonight, she sat alone in her sitting room, surrounded by photographs of a love that had once seemed unbreakable, and quietly mourned for the marriage that was already over in everything but name. The next morning arrived with an unseasonably cold wind rattling the windows of their private apartments. Catherine had barely slept, spending most of the night rehearsing the words she needed to say to William. By the time dawn broke, she had settled on a simple truth. They needed to talk, really talk, for the first time in months. William was already dressed and reviewing his schedule when Catherine entered their bedroom. He looked up briefly, offering the polite smile he had perfected for public appearances before returning to his papers. It was the same smile he gave to diplomats and charity representatives, pleasant but completely empty of warmth. "William," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt, "we need to talk." Something in her tone must have caught his attention, because he actually looked at her properly for the first time in weeks. She saw a flash of what might have been concern, or perhaps fear, cross his face before his royal training kicked in, and his expression became carefully neutral. "Of course," he said, setting down his papers. "What about?" Catherine almost laughed at the question. "What about?" "Everything. Nothing. The fact that they had become strangers living in the same house. The fact that their children barely knew their father. The fact that she felt more alone in her marriage than she had ever felt as a single woman. About us," she said simply. "About what's happening to us." William's shoulders tensed, and Catherine could see him mentally preparing his defenses. This was how he handled difficult conversations now, like diplomatic negotiations where every word was carefully measured and calculated. But Catherine was done with diplomacy. She was done with pretending that everything was fine when their world was quietly falling apart. "I don't know what you mean," William said, but his eyes couldn't quite meet hers as he spoke. "Yes, you do," Catherine replied gently. "You know exactly what I mean. We barely speak to each other anymore unless it's about schedules or the children. We haven't had dinner together without official business to discuss in over a month. You come home and disappear into your study, and I pretend not to notice that you'd rather be anywhere else." William stood up and walked to the window, his back rigid with tension. Catherine could see the battle playing out in his posture. The part of him that wanted to maintain the facade, fighting against the part that was exhausted from carrying the pretense. "I have responsibilities," he said finally, his voice tight. "The duties I have to the crown, to the Commonwealth, they're not optional, Catherine. I can't just set them aside for convenience." "I'm not asking you to set them aside," Catherine said, moving closer to him. "I'm asking you to remember that you have responsibilities to your family too, to your children, to me." William turned around then, and Catherine was shocked by the exhaustion she saw in his eyes. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was a deep, soul-deep weariness that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "Do you think I don't know that?" he asked, his carefully controlled voice finally showing cracks. "Do you think I don't feel the weight of every single expectation every single day? The country expects me to be the perfect prince. The children need me to be the perfect father, and you want me to be the perfect husband. But I'm just one person, Catherine. I'm just one person, and I'm drowning." The admission hung in the air. Between them, like a bridge, neither of them knew how to cross. Catherine felt her anger soften into something more complicated, a mixture of compassion and frustration, and deep, deep sadness. "You're not drowning alone," she said softly. "At least, you don't have to be. But you've shut me out so completely that I don't know how to help you anymore. I don't even know who you are anymore." William ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded Catherine painfully of the young man she had fallen in love with. "I don't know who I am anymore either," he said quietly. "I feel like I'm disappearing bit by bit, becoming this thing that everyone needs me to be instead of the person I actually am. And the worst part is, I don't even remember what that person was like." Catherine's heart broke a little more at his words. She could see now that while she had been mourning the loss of her husband, William had been mourning the loss of himself. The crown that would one day sit on his head was already crushing the spirit of the man she loved. "I remember," she said, stepping closer to him. "I remember the man who used to wake up early just to bring me coffee in bed. I remember the father who would spend hours building blanket forts with George and Charlotte. I remember the prince who told me that being with me made him feel like just William, and that was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him." William's eyes filled with tears that he was too well trained to let fall. "That man feels like a stranger to me now," he whispered. "I don't know how to be him anymore when everyone needs me to be so much more." "What if," Catherine said carefully, Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, you just tried to be something to the people who matter most. What if we figured out how to save what's left of us before it's too late? For a moment, Catherine saw a spark of hope in William's eyes, a glimpse of the man who had once promised to love her through everything. But then she watched as the walls came back up, as duty and obligation reasserted their grip on his heart. "It might already be too late," he said, and Catherine knew he wasn't just talking about their marriage. He was talking about himself, about the person he used to be before the weight of his destiny had crushed it out of him. The silence that followed was different from the others they had shared in recent months. This one was heavy with truth instead of avoidance, filled with acknowledged pain instead of pretended indifference. They both knew they had finally said out loud what had been slowly killing them both. Catherine reached out and took William's hand, surprised when he didn't pull away. His skin was cold, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Maybe it's not too late," she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "Maybe we just need to figure out how to find our way back to each other." William looked down at their joined hands, and Catherine wondered if he was remembering all the times they had held hands before, walking down the aisle on their wedding day, during the births of their children, through countless public appearances, where their connection had been real instead of performed. "I don't know how," he admitted, and in those 4 words, Catherine heard both his vulnerability and his fear. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine and William's emotional conversation, and despite their mutual acknowledgement that something needed to change, nothing actually had. If anything, the gap between them seemed to be widening even faster now, that they both knew how deep the problem ran. The honesty they had shared that morning had created an awkwardness that neither of them knew how to navigate. William had made a few small efforts. He had read to the children twice, and he had asked Catherine about her day during dinner one evening. But these gestures felt forced and uncomfortable, like he was checking items off a list rather than genuinely reconnecting with his family. Catherine appreciated the attempts, but they only highlighted how far they had drifted apart. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late autumn. Catherine had spent the day at a children's hospital, one of her favorite patronages, photographing sick children and their families for a charity calendar. The experience had filled her with the kind of purpose and joy that had been missing from her life for months. She returned home energized and hopeful, eager to share the stories of the brave children she had met with William. She found him in his study, as usual, but this time he wasn't alone. His private secretary was there, along with 2 other officials Catherine didn't recognize. Papers were spread across his desk, and everyone was speaking in the hushed, urgent tones that typically accompanied crisis management. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, backing toward the door. "I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "Catherine, wait," William called out, and something in his voice made her stomach clench. "Actually, this concerns you too. Please sit down." The officials looked uncomfortable, clearly preferring to handle royal business without involving family members. But William gestured for Catherine to take a seat on the small sofa near his desk. She sat down, her earlier joy evaporating as she tried to read the expressions on everyone's faces. "There's been a development," William began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used during press conferences. "Some photographs have surfaced, photographs of us from recent public appearances." Catherine frowned, confused. Photographs of them at public events were hardly unusual. Their pictures appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world on a regular basis. "What kind of photographs?" she asked. William's private secretary cleared his throat and slid a tablet across the desk toward Catherine. On the screen were a series of images from their recent appearances together: a charity gala, a state dinner, a school opening. At first glance, they looked like typical royal photographs. But as Catherine studied them more closely, she began to see what everyone else was seeing. In every single photo, she and William looked like strangers. They stood near each other but never touched. They smiled at the cameras, but never at each other. Their body language spoke of distance and discomfort, and now that it was captured, in still images, the disconnect between them was painfully obvious. "The tabloids are calling it the royal marriage in crisis," one of the officials said gently. "They're running stories about a potential separation." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so focused on their private struggles that she hadn't considered how their problems might appear to the outside world. In her naivety, she had thought they were still successfully maintaining their public facade. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. William rubbed his temples, looking older than his years. "Bad enough that we need to make some decisions. The palace can issue denials, of course, but the photographs are quite damaging. People aren't stupid, Catherine. They can see that something's wrong." The room fell silent as everyone waited for someone else to speak. Catherine stared at the tablet screen, seeing her own misery reflected back at her in high definition. The woman in these photos looked tired and sad, nothing like the glowing princess the public expected to see. "What kind of decisions?" she asked finally. "Well," William's private secretary said carefully, "there are several options. We could arrange some positive photo opportunities, a family vacation perhaps, or some more intimate public appearances where you both appear more connected." "You want us to fake it?" Catherine said flatly. "We want you to present a united front," another official corrected, "for the good of the monarchy." Catherine looked at William, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would indicate he saw how absurd this was. They were being asked to perform their marriage for the cameras while it died in private. But William just sat there, his face a mask of royal composure, considering the options like this was any other diplomatic situation that required careful management. "Or," William said slowly, "we could consider the alternative." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone in the room knew what he meant, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. "A trial separation," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what you mean, isn't it?" William nodded, still not looking at her directly. "It would be temporary, of course, just until we can figure out how to move forward. The children would stay primarily with you, naturally, and we would maintain our public duties as much as possible." Catherine felt like she was listening to William discuss someone else's life. His tone was so clinical, so detached, as if they were negotiating a business arrangement rather than discussing the end of their family as they knew it. "And if we can't figure out how to move forward?" she asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. They all knew that royal divorces, while not impossible, were complicated affairs that would dominate headlines for years and potentially damage the monarchy's reputation. It would mean their children growing up in the shadow of their parents' failed marriage, just as William had. "I need some air," Catherine said abruptly, standing up from the sofa. "I can't. I need to think." She walked quickly from the room, ignoring William's calls for her to wait. The walls of the palace suddenly felt like they were closing in on her, and she needed to escape before she couldn't breathe at all. Catherine found herself in the garden, the same one she had looked down at from her window just weeks earlier when this all began. The roses were dying now, their petals brown and scattered by the autumn wind. She sat on a stone bench and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the careful, silent tears she had been shedding in private, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place of profound loss. She was mourning not just her marriage, but the future she had imagined for her children. George, Charlotte, and Louis would grow up with parents who lived in different homes, who appeared together only for official functions and school events. They would learn to navigate the complicated choreography of divorced parents, just like William had been forced to do after his parents' marriage imploded in a very public way. But perhaps most painful of all was the realization that William could discuss their separation with such clinical detachment. The man she had married would have been devastated by the thought of their family breaking apart. This version of William seemed almost relieved to have an official excuse to create even more distance between them. As the evening shadows grew longer, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. She wasn't ready to give up entirely, not yet, but she also couldn't continue living in this limbo of pretending everything was fine while slowly dying inside. Tomorrow, she would tell William that she agreed to the trial separation, not because she wanted their marriage to end, but because she hoped that losing what they had left might finally wake him up to what he was throwing away. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only card she had left to play. The announcement of the trial separation was carefully worded and released on a quiet Friday afternoon, designed to minimize media attention. The palace statement spoke of temporary living arrangements to allow both parties time for personal reflection, and emphasized that the prince and princess remain committed to their duties and to co-parenting their children. To the outside world, it sounded measured and mutual. In reality, it felt like signing the death certificate for everything Catherine had once believed about love and forever. Moving out of the home she had shared with William was one of the most painful experiences of Catherine's life. She had chosen to relocate to Anmer Hall, their country residence in Norfolk, taking the children with her as planned. As she packed her belongings, each item seemed to hold a memory that cut deeper than the last. The silk scarf William had brought her from his first official tour of Australia. The framed photo from Charlotte's christening where they both looked genuinely happy. The book of poetry he had given her for their 5th wedding anniversary, inscribed with words that now seemed to belong to different people entirely. The children had taken the news better than Catherine had expected, though she suspected they didn't fully understand the permanence of what was happening. George, now old enough to grasp more than his siblings, had asked thoughtful questions about when Papa would visit and whether they would still spend Christmas together. Charlotte had been mainly concerned about whether she could still call William whenever she wanted to, while Louis had seemed most upset about leaving his favorite climbing tree in the Windsor Gardens. The first few weeks of separation were a strange mixture of relief and devastation. Catherine found herself sleeping better than she had in months, no longer lying awake listening for William's footsteps or wondering when he would finally come to bed. The constant tension that had filled their home was gone, replaced by a quieter sadness that was somehow easier to bear. But the relief was accompanied by a loneliness so profound that some days Catherine felt like she was drowning in it. William visited the children every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and every other weekend. These visits were scheduled with the precision of official royal engagements, coordinated by their respective private secretaries rather than arranged through casual conversation between two parents. Catherine found the formality heartbreaking, but she also had to admit that William seemed more present during these planned visits than he had been when they all lived together. Without the pressure of maintaining their marriage, William appeared to relax slightly with the children. Catherine would watch from the kitchen window as he played football with George in the garden, or sit quietly nearby while he read bedtime stories to Charlotte and Louis. In these moments, she caught glimpses of the father he had once been, and it made their situation even more tragic. During one of his visits, William lingered after putting the children to bed. Catherine found him in the kitchen, making himself tea with the easy familiarity of someone who had once called this place home. "They seem happy," he said, not looking at her directly. "Settled." "They miss you," Catherine replied honestly. "But yes, I think the routine is good for them. Children need stability, even if it's not the stability we originally planned to give them." William nodded, stirring his tea with more attention than the task required. "And you? How are you managing?" It was a polite question, the kind he might ask any acquaintance, and Catherine felt the distance between them like a physical ache. "Some days are better than others," she said. "I've started painting again. Remember how I used to paint?" William's hand stilled on the spoon, and Catherine saw something flicker across his face. "At university," he said softly, "you painted that landscape of St. Andrew's Bay. I always loved that painting." "I still have it," Catherine said, surprised that he remembered. "It's hanging in my bedroom here." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, and Catherine wondered if he was remembering. The same thing she was. Lazy Sunday mornings in their university flat, William reading while she painted, both of them content to simply exist in each other's presence. "Catherine," William said suddenly, setting down his cup, "I want you to know that this isn't what I wanted. None of this is what I wanted." "Then why are we here?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle rather than accusatory. "If this isn't what either of us wanted, why are we living in separate houses and scheduling visits with our children like divorced parents?" William was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "Because I don't know how to be both," he said. "I don't know how to be the prince that everyone needs me to be and the husband and father that you and the children deserve. Every time I try to balance it, I fail at everything. At least this way, when I'm here with them, I can just be their father. And when I'm fulfilling my royal duties, I can give that my full attention without feeling like I'm stealing time from my family." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes. "But what about what you need? What about what makes you happy?" William gave her a look that was so sad it nearly broke her heart. "I stopped thinking about what makes me happy a long time ago," he said. "Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that duty and happiness were mutually exclusive for people like me." "They don't have to be," Catherine said softly. "Your mother proved that. She found ways to be both a princess and a person. She never let the crown completely consume who she was." William flinched at the mention of Diana, as he always did. "My mother also paid a terrible price for trying to have both," he said. "Her marriage ended in disaster. The media hounded her until the day she died. I won't put you through that. I won't put our children through that." Catherine realized then that William wasn't just running from their marriage. He was running from love itself. He had decided that caring too much, wanting too much, was dangerous for everyone involved. In his mind, the separation wasn't just protecting their family from his inadequacies as a husband and father. It was protecting them from the destructive power of his love. "So what happens now?" Catherine asked. "Do we just continue like this, indefinitely, living separate lives and pretending that's normal?" William looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I wish I could give you a better answer, but I genuinely don't know." After he left that evening, Catherine sat alone in the kitchen where they had shared so many meals as a family. She understood now that their marriage hadn't ended because William stopped loving her. It had ended because he loved her too much to believe he deserved to keep her. The man she had married was still there, buried under layers of duty and self-imposed isolation, but she was beginning to wonder if he would ever find the courage to dig his way back to the surface. 6 months into their separation, Catherine received a phone call that would change everything. It was late on a Tuesday evening, and she was reading in her bedroom when her phone rang. William's name appeared on the screen, which wasn't unusual. He often called to discuss arrangements for the children or upcoming royal events they would both need to attend, but something in his voice when she answered told her this call was different. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough and strained. "I need to see you. Tonight. It's important." She could hear something in the background. Voices, movement, the distinctive sound of hospital corridors. Her heart immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Is it one of the children? Are they hurt? No, no, the children are fine, William said quickly. It's King Charles. He's had a heart attack. He's stable, but it was serious. Very serious. Catherine felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Despite the complexities of their separation, Charles had always been kind to her, treating her like the daughter he had never had. More importantly, she knew what this meant for William. The crown that had been slowly crushing him from a distance was now suddenly, terrifyingly close. I'm coming, she said, already reaching for her clothes. Which hospital? The London clinic, William said. Catherine, I can't do this alone. I know I have no right to ask, but I can't face this alone. The vulnerability in his voice broke through all the careful distance they had maintained over the past months. This wasn't the dutiful prince speaking, or the careful co-parent. This was the man she had married, scared and overwhelmed, and reaching out for the only person who truly understood what his life meant. Catherine arrived at the hospital to find William sitting alone in a private waiting room, still wearing the formal suit from whatever engagement he had been attending when the call came. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and he looked younger and more fragile than she had seen him in years. When he looked up and saw her, the relief in his eyes was so profound that Catherine felt her own tears start to fall. Without thinking, she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. William collapsed into her embrace, and for the first time in over a year, Catherine felt like she was holding her husband instead of a stranger. They stayed like that for several minutes, neither speaking, both drawing strength from a connection they had almost forgotten they still shared. How is he? Catherine asked when they finally pulled apart. The doctors say he's going to recover, but it will take time. Months, maybe longer. William ran his hands through his hair in the gesture she remembered so well. They're saying he needs to step back from his duties, at least temporarily, maybe permanently. Catherine understood the implications immediately. William would need to take on more responsibilities, possibly including some that would normally fall to the reigning monarch. The pressure that had already been destroying their marriage was about to increase exponentially. We'll figure it out, she said automatically, the words coming from a place of pure instinct. William looked at her with surprise. We? Catherine realized what she had said, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The word hung between them, carrying the weight of everything they had been and everything they had lost. I mean, Catherine started, then stopped. She looked at William, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in months. Fear, yes, but also hope. A tiny, fragile hope that maybe he didn't have to face this alone after all. Do you remember, Catherine said slowly, what you told me on our wedding day? When we were having those last few minutes alone before the ceremony? William's expression softened. I told you that as long as we were together, I could handle anything the world threw at us. And I told you that I didn't marry a prince. I married you. The man who brought me terrible coffee in bed, and who could make me laugh until I cried, and who had the courage to choose love over duty when it mattered. William looked down at his hands. But I didn't choose love over duty, did I? When it really mattered, I chose duty. I chose the crown over you, over our children, over everything that actually made me happy. Maybe, Catherine said gently. But maybe there's another choice. Maybe instead of choosing between love and duty, you choose to let the people who love you help you carry the duty. William was quiet for a long time, and Catherine could almost see the internal battle playing out behind his eyes. The part of him that had learned to carry everything alone was fighting against the part that remembered what it felt like to have a partner. I've made such a mess of everything, he said finally. Our marriage, our family, my relationship with the children. How do you come back from that? Catherine reached over and took his hand, surprised by how familiar it still felt despite the months they had spent apart. One day at a time, she said. One conversation at a time. one moment of choosing each other at a time. "Would you consider it?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Coming back? Trying again?" Catherine felt her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. "Only if you can promise me something." "Anything. Promise me that you'll remember that we're supposed to be a team. That when you're drowning in duty and responsibility, you'll reach for me instead of pushing me away. Promise me that you'll choose to let me love you, even when the crown tells you that you don't deserve it." William lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender and familiar that Catherine felt years of carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "I promise," he said. "I can't promise I'll be perfect at it, or that I won't slip back into old patterns sometimes, but I promise I'll try. I promise I'll remember that loving you isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that's ever made me strong enough to be the man this country needs me to be." 3 weeks later, Catherine and the children moved back to Windsor. The transition wasn't seamless. They all had to learn how to be a family again, how to navigate the space between William's duty and their private life. There were difficult conversations and moments of frustration as they rebuilt trust and intimacy that had been damaged by months of separation. But there were also small miracles. William reading bedtime stories with voices that made the children giggle. Family dinners where they talked about silly things instead of schedules. Moments when Catherine would catch William looking at her with something that looked remarkably like the adoration she remembered from their early days together. Most importantly, when the pressures of royal life threatened to overwhelm William, he learned to turn toward his family instead of away from them. Catherine became his partner in duty as well as in love, helping him find ways to serve the crown without sacrificing his soul. Their fairy tale had ended, but their real love story, messier and more complicated and infinitely more valuable, was just beginning. And when King Charles eventually returned to his duties months later, he found his son transformed, not just into a more capable future king, but into a man who had learned that true strength came not from carrying burdens alone, but from having the courage to share them with the people who loved him most.